побачитися. Особисто я дуже чекала цієї лекції, оскільки тема важлива для всіх присутніх сьогодні, для України і насправді для утвердження правосуддя у цілому. Наступна година буде присвячена темі документування та розслідування сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом, адже дуже гострим і під час наших попередніх лекцій ми дуже часто піднімали питання важливої комунікації, роботи із потерпілими, про те, як насправді уникнути на практиці ретравматизації, як таки реалізувати цей принцип не нашкодь, про який так ми стільки сьогодні говоримо, і як таки ефективно реалізувати і провести слідчі дії, документувати злочини, комунікувати із потерпілими від СНПК різних статей, різних вікових груп. І про це все і про інше сьогодні буде із нашими чудовими фахівчинями, юристками, і які багато років поспіль працюють із темою СНПК, тому я дуже заохочую всіх учасників та учасниць не нехтувати нагодою написати питання, так, і задати те, що турбує в межах вашої практики, якщо ви безпосередньо працюєте із темою СНПК, або якщо плануєте працювати. З нами сьогодні Катерина Бусол, за якою, я впевнена, ми всі дуже сумували, враховуючи всі наші зустрічі у червні і на початку липня. Також з нами сьогодні Данае, Стратен, Понтоз, яка, до речі, є співавторкою міжнародного протоколу по документуванню і розслідуванню сексуального насильства під час конфлікту, який я теж впевнена, принаймні я ледь не щодня його відкриваю. І як я впевнена, практично вся правозахисна і правнича спільнота України сьогодні. І також з нами чудова Амаль Нассар, яка є експерткою з міжнародного кримінального правосуддя і теж велетенським досвідом документування злочинів, пов'язаних із конфліктом, в тому числі гендерно обумовленого, зокрема сексуального насильства. Перед тим, як ми розпочнемо, я лише наголошу ще декілька організаційних моментів. Якщо у вашому місті буде оголошена повітряна тривога, ми проводимо запис і обов'язково ним поділимося, тому, будь ласка, не забувайте про те, що вам, і ми дуже закликаємо, потрібно піти в укриття, адже записом ми поділимося. Окрім цього, Амаль та Данае розмовлятимуть англійською мовою. Якщо вам зручніше слухати українською, у нас є функція перекладу, у нижній панелі Zoom є кнопка перекладу, вам потрібно обрати саме український варіант, і тоді ви зможете чути перекладачок, за що ми теж нам дуже вдячні сьогодні. І, звичайно, залишайте свої питання або у чаті, або в спеціальному боті Questions and Answers. Ми обов'язково їх модеруватимемо, ви можете їх залишати впродовж нашої лекції, а опісля ми обов'язково виділимо спікерками час на те, аби на них усіх відповісти. Я ще раз дуже дякую, дорогі колежанки. Я думаю, ми можемо розпочинати, і я радо передаю вам слово.
Спасибі велике, Вікторія. Добрий день, дорогі колеги. Спасибі, що ви наприкінці п'ятниці вирішили приєднатися і послухати, і поспілкуватись з такого непростого питання, яке, на жаль, в контексті України не могло бути актуальнішим. Багато хто з нас сьогодні прокинувся щодо новин про катування над українським військовополоненим російськими солдатами, і однією з форм цього катування була кастрація ножем. І якраз сьогодні ми поговоримо так само про документування подібних злочинів та про зв'язок сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом, з іншими типами злочинів, а також про те, які стигми та упередження існують, і про те, що насправді цей злочин не є виключно жіночим. Я зараз запущу в чат неймовірно цікаву бесіду Патрішії Віжер-Селерс. Це колишня радниця прокурора Міжнародного кримінального суду з питання гендеру та сексуального насильства, і людина, яка заклала основи організації слідства для колишніх трибуналів по Югославії та Руанді, і вона якраз дуже багато говорить про ті упередження, які досі 20 років по тому справджуються в Україні. Я не хочу забирати багато часу, дуже коротко зазначу, зазначу, що СНПК є, на жаль, явищем характерним для російсько-українського збройного конфлікту не з лютого цього року, а з 2014 року, з моменту початку агресії. До ескалації цього року основними місцями вчинення СНПК були місця несвободи, так звані сірі зони вздовж лінії розмежування і, звісно, тимчасово окуповані території. Мої колежанки детальніше говоритимуть про велике дослідження, яке ми нещодавно презентували щодо потреб у репараціях потерпілих саме від сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом в Україні. Але почнемо ми нашу презентацію з більш загального огляду, який надасть моя колежанка Данае Стратен Понтоз щодо основних уроків та найкращих міжнародних практик стосовно документації та розслідування СНПК. А Амаль уже більше говоритиме про висновки нашої роботи щодо України. І я дуже вдячна, що колежанки знайшли можливість доєднатись до нашої бесіди сьогодні, тому що, насправді, на відміну від дуже багатьох колег, у них унікальна експертиза, тому що вона поєднує значний міжнародний досвід із не просто знанням та практичною роботою щодо України, а й з великою любов'ю до України та бажанням допомогти. Отже, Данае. Dear Данае, I'm switching to English now, and the first question goes to you. Could you please briefly just tell us about your organization, Global Survivors Fund, and also the work that you have been doing on and for Ukraine?
Thank you, Katerina. And before I start, I really would like to extend my warmest thanks to the organizer ЮrФем Association for inviting me a second time to speak to all of you. I'm the head of advocacy and policy at the Global Survivors Fund, which is an organization that has been established in 2019 with the mission of enhancing access to reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And our organization has been set up by the two Nobel Peace Prize of 2018, the Congolese doctor Mukwege and the Yazidi activist Nadia Murad. And what we do is really to bring different stakeholders together to make reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence a reality. And one of the specificities of the organization is that we are really survivor-centric, and we have developed a unique co-creation model to our work. So although on the international law, as you all know, there is a well-established right to reparation that is recognized for victims of gross human rights violation and violation of humanitarian law, in practice, only a tiny proportion of victims worldwide have ever received any form of reparation. And we see that because we work in almost 30 countries, and this is really shocking to see how big the implementation gap is. So the way we are organized is that we're working around three main pillars. First, we act in certain situations by providing what we call interim reparative measures, which are co-created with survivors. And we do this in situations where the state who bears the primary responsibility to provide the reparation or the other parties responsible for the violence are either unwilling or unable to provide the reparation. And the interim reparative measures that we provide, they can take many forms, livelihood packages, it can be financing access to education and healthcare, or financial compensation, but also symbolic forms of reparation. Currently, we've got ongoing projects in Guinea, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Central African Republic, in Iraq. We've just started a project in Turkey to benefit Syrian survivors. And in the coming months, we will set up projects also in Nigeria and South Sudan. So this is the first, big part of our work. Then the second pillar of our work, which is the one that I lead, is really focused on advocacy for the duty bearers and the international community, for them to really acknowledge survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and their suffering, and to take their responsibility to deliver survivor-centric reparation programs. Maybe something that I should highlight here is that whilst the Global Survivors Fund supports all forms of reparation, because we know that accountability and judicial reparation are often very elusive and can take many years for survivors to access, and also only are relevant for a very tiny proportion of survivors, the Global Survivors Fund has decided to focus its effort on administrative reparation programs, which have the potential of addressing the needs of a far larger number of survivors in a faster way, and also with lower evidentiary thresholds. And then the third aspect of our work, which is particularly relevant in the context of Ukraine, is that we also provide expertise and technical assistance to states and other stakeholders, but mainly to states, for them to design reparation program. And we also disseminate best practice in the field of reparation. So that's in a nutshell what our organization is about. Then if we move to, more specifically our work in Ukraine, the Global Survivors Fund has been working actually with Katerina and Amal here today for the past 2 years in Ukraine as part of our global reparation study, which is a study that covers more than 20 countries across the world and really aimed at taking stock of the status and opportunities for reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And this study really represents the first ever comprehensive attempt to assess reparation opportunities worldwide. Amal will tell you more later about our work in Ukraine as part of the Global Reparation Study and the study that Katerina and her have authored. Our executive director was in Ukraine actually just a few weeks ago. And as Katerina mentioned, she heard really harrowing accounts of women, girls, and boys being subject to sexual violence in public spaces, of mothers being raped in front of their children, or other family members, or of children being forced to watch the rape of other family members or their parents. So these crimes really are intended to leave deep scars, long-lasting marks, not only on the survivors and the victims, but also on their families, on the communities, and really destroy the fabric of society. I'm happy to announce that as of last week, the Global Survivors Fund and our sister organization, the Mukwege Foundation, we have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ukrainian authorities, more specifically with the Office of the Deputy Minister for EU Integration and the Government Commissioners for Gender Equality Policy. And what this partnership is about is that the Mukwege Foundation, a sister organization, will support Ukraine in setting up a one-stop center model of holistic care for CISV survivors, really taking lessons learned from all the work that Dr. Mukwege has been doing in the Democratic Republic of Congo over the last 20 years and adapting that model to Ukraine. And on our part, the Global Survivors Fund, we will provide technical assistance to the Ukrainian authorities to develop a whole framework for urgent interim reparation, including compensation. And the idea is really to develop a model where accountability, reparation, compensation effort, humanitarian initiatives are, really constitute building blocks to make reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine a reality.
Dania, thank you very much for that. And it's, well, great to know that you've got the legacy of the work in Ukraine. And my second question is built on that. Actually, now we see such a rise in the documentation activities aimed at the crime, which has been quite neglected, to be honest, both by the state and by the civil society before this mass invasion in February this year. So what would be your recommendation for Ukraine when there is so much good willingness and proactivity on the one hand, but then of course there's also the need to ensure the re-traumatization of the survivors? How should the stakeholders involved in the documentation tackle this balance?
Thank you, Katerina. It's great that now there is more interest to really address this issue, but of course, as a practitioners, there's a really big responsibility when you work in that field. If you do your job well, in a trauma, sensitive, and survivor-centric manner, you can really support victims in their journey and to help them recover and help them through that to pursue justice, accountability, and reparation. But on the contrary, poorly trained investigators or other practitioners, even with the best intentions, can really contribute to harm and then to the denial of justice. So in practice, that means that practitioners who do not have the appropriate training and the specialist skill that such work requires should refrain from interacting with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, because even with the best intention, as I said, they can actually harm them. And of course, it's great to attend training and lectures like this one, but this is not sufficient to be able to conduct this type of work. And you need proper, long-term mentoring by colleagues with the relevant expertise, knowledge, and sensitivity. I take this opportunity to promote some of the work that has been done by the International Institute for Criminal Investigation in The Hague, and I collaborated to that effort. You mentioned the international protocol earlier, which is translated in Ukrainian, but there is also a set of training materials that I've developed for IICI to accompany the international protocol. And for each chapter of the protocol, from do no harm, planning, evidence, interviewing techniques, sexual violence against men and boys, there is a PowerPoint presentation and there are guidance notes for trainers. Of course, this material needs to be tailored for each specific context, but it is available free of charge on the website of IICI. And I think it can really create, or provide a good foundation for those who want to better understand the requirement and start to build their expertise on the proper documentation of sexual violence.
Thank you very much, Danае. Yeah, and indeed, it's great that the training materials are essentially so elaborate that it could be a good starting point. And speaking more about the state effort, it's the observation of the human rights lawyers, but also in a way the admission of Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors themselves. They oftentimes, when they deal with the cases related to conflict-related sexual violence, they essentially approach such cases with the same evidentiary threshold, the way they would approach the peacetime sexual violence. So how dangerous is such an approach, and why the evidence and proving conflict-related sexual violence is essentially fundamentally different?
Thank you, Katia. Yes, indeed. And I think it's the case maybe in Ukraine, but it happens in other contexts as well. The problem is that building a case of sexual violence which amounts to a war crime, crimes against humanity, or act of genocide is extremely different to building a case of sexual violence as an ordinary crime. And the big difference between violations that are committed during peacetime and violations committed during conflict is that in conflictom, there may not be any documentary, physical or digital evidence to collect to corroborate the crime. And it's not uncommon for testimonials to be the only form of evidence available. And this can be, for several reasons, either because, the crimes were committed a long time ago. For instance, in the case of Ukraine, for the crimes committed in 2014, 2015, there may be no evidence, or because there was, no access to medical facilities at the time of the crime, or because there was evidence, documentary evidence that's been destroyed since. So for this reason, on the international criminal practice, entire cases have been built by relying mainly on victim and witness testimony. So what you need to keep in mind is that really the victim is the evidence and that you don't need anything else. In addition, at the International Criminal Court and as well in other international tribunals and courts, they have established rules to protect victims from other trauma and to take into consideration the particularities and the particular nature of crimes of sexual violence. And these rules of procedure and evidence, they've been developed to protect the victims from irrelevant or very overtly aggressive or humiliating methods of questioning. And I'd like to mention 3 points here. First, around consent. In domestic context, victims of sexual violence are very often forced to demonstrate to the court that they did not consent to the sexual act. On the international criminal practice, actually the emphasis has completely shifted away from this. And now, instead of having to prove the absence of consent, you need to prove the presence, or it's sufficient to prove the presence of coercive circumstances, such as, for instance, detention or military presence. And once you have proven the existence of coercive circumstances, these circumstances make consent impossible. So this means that the questions that are being asked to a victim, whether she or he has physically resisted, these are completely irrelevant. So that's the first point. Second, there are questions that are prohibited on the international criminal practice, typically questions about prior or subsequent sexual conduct. And these questions are prohibited because actually they are completely relevant to the consent that may have or may not have been given in a specific instance. And the third one, which is really, really important, is about corroboration. On the principles of international criminal procedures, no corroboration is required in case of sexual violence. That's what I said before, entire case have sometimes, can theoretically rely on one single testimony. And actually before the International Criminal Court, corroboration is not required to prove any of the crimes. Of course, to strengthen a case, you can provide corroborating evidence from witnesses or other forms of evidence. But for instance, in a case of sexual violence, imagine in the context of detention, maybe you can have corroborating evidence from other detainees about what happened to the victim before he or she was taken away and after, but you don't necessarily need evidence or corroborating evidence about the act itself. Of course, we need to keep in mind that the rules of the national rules of procedure and evidence may not be in line with international standards, and in many contexts, the testimony of the victims alone is not sufficient to obtain a criminal conviction, and there's either requirement, whether formal or informal, for such testimony to be corroborated by medical legal evidence or other evidence. But this is extremely problematic, and it's important to highlight the fact that it's not in line with international standards. And these requirements are problematic because they really create a significant barrier to accessing justice for the victims, because those victims usually do not have access to other forms, to medical facilities. They cannot, we don't have medical legal evidence to submit. So it's really important to create a shift in the approach for these type of crimes.
Thank you very much, Danaya, and especially when you spoke about corroboration and consent. I again call upon our audience to take a look at this paper which we posted, the conversation between Patricia Vision-Sellers and her Australian colleague, because they, in a totally fascinating but very acceptable manner, discuss how the very gender-biased actually approach of many investigators, prosecutors, and judges have prevented the more open-minded jurisprudence from the ICTR and especially ICTY from emerging. And she, in a very fascinating manner, discusses how they, as an investigative team, really wanted to go beyond the assessment of even these coercive circumstances, because they still tried, certain judges in certain cases tried to assess, especially in Kunarak, how the coercive circumstances could contribute to consent or not, whereas Patricia, of course, argued that no consent at all is possible. But the whole conversation about consent, she argues, is premised on the fact that the victim is a female, because, with a male, we don't even question whether he essentially wants or doesn't want sexual encounter. And I found that completely fascinating. And speaking about more the survivors, Danaya, you said this brilliantly, that essentially a victim is evidence, and therefore the manner in which we treat a victim is very important. So what would be the key pieces of advice you'd give here?
Yes, so indeed, yeah, one of the key messages I think for today is that the victim is the evidence. And this is one of the reasons also that in the international protocol, there's such a strong emphasis on interviewing techniques. But before talking about, how to, properly interview and elicit evidence from victims and survivors, I'd like just to say a few words about planning and preparation, which is a crucial first step that you cannot, absolutely cannot skip. And as part of the preparation, some of the consideration that you need to consider are, what's the purpose of your documentation, whether you document for, advocacy purposes, for criminal accountability purposes, whether you've got an official mandate or not, whether you really need to interview a specific witness, or maybe you could access relevant information through another source to avoid duplication. So these are all, we're not going to get into the details, but the planning is really important. And then after that, you also need to consider, where you can have, referral and support systems in place for the specific witness or victim, and it will be different if you're talking about female, male, or child survivors. You need to assess also the risk factors, for yourself, but also for the victim. And then, very practical aspects like, finding a private and comfortable, confidential space to conduct the interview, consider how you're going to record the information, how you're going to transport it, how you're going to store it in a safe way. So all those very, very important aspects. And so we don't have the time to further elaborate on this, but, at the end of that planning phase, you may well come to the conclusion that actually you should refrain or you should postpone an interview because, the risk cannot be mitigated to an acceptable level. So that's really a very important first step. Then if we move, if you decide that actually you can and should conduct an interview and you can do it in a way that's not going to create further harm, there are some key consideration also to ensure that this is, done correctly. So the first thing to consider is that you need to allow the victim or the witness to tell the story at their own rhythm and in their own word without interrupting them. And interruption can really negatively impact memory recall. So it may have as a consequence, if you interrupt the witness, that you will miss critical information. So it's really important to allow the time and space for an uninterrupted free recall account. And a way of encouraging this as a practitioner is you can just it's like that posture of active listening, and you can just, say or just nod, just to encourage the person to continue speaking without interrupting them. And it's important also to keep in mind that an interview is not an interrogation. It's really a conversation that you need to consciously manage to obtain the best and most accurate information. And the underlying foundation for any interview really is to ensure that any information that you gather is not obtained improperly or not influenced by something that you may be saying yourself. So what this means in practice, so of course, as an interviewer, you need to have really good communication skills, but also something to keep in mind is that you need to ask open-ended questions. So open-ended questions are questions that call for a narrative answer. And you need to avoid closed questions, which are questions that call for yes or no answer, or leading question, which will influence the response that you may be given. And if you think about it, and that's something that I very often do when I conduct trainings, most closed questions can actually be reframed in an open-ended manner. And it's actually kind of fun exercise to, list your question and then really look at them and see how you can transform them to call for an open answer. So of course, there's, you should never ask a question like, did you get raped? This is not only intrusive and highly inappropriate, but also as a closed question and leading question, the answer, at least in an international context, means that the evidence would be dismissed. So instead, you can ask a simple question like, just tell me what happened. So question with what, when, where, how, those very open questions are key to get an accurate account. So now if you move, to other, more specific consideration specific to conflict-related sexual violence, as an interviewer, you need to be able to recognize key terms and codes that will be used to refer to sexual acts. Very often, witnesses will not talk explicitly. Male victims, for instance, they will often use terms like, I was treated as a woman, or I was, a woman can say that she was insulted, or that people did bad things to her. So, or that, people tortured me, or something like this. Usually, you need to recognize them as red flags that potentially sexual violence may have taken place. And then you can very gently and in an open manner say, can you tell me more, or what do you mean when you said that people did bad things to you? And just let the person continue their account. The second point that I want to make here is that you also need to feel comfortable talking about bodily parts. So if you cannot say comfortably the word penis, vagina, anus, as comfortably as you talk about non-sexual part of the body, you will not be able to get the evidence that you need, at least, for criminal accountability purposes. And then lastly, in order for the victim to feel comfortable, it's for you to create an environment that is conducive and where the person will feel comfortable enough to speak. And this will generally require more time and efforts when you deal with sexual violence than when you deal with any other crimes. Also, the gender of the person who conducts the interview generally matters to the victim. So ideally, you should give the option to the victim or the witness to choose between a male or female interviewer. Then, as I said, very important to have plenty of time and to take the time at the beginning of the interview to build a rapport with the witness. usually survivors of sexual violence will need more time before they feel comfortable opening up. So if you've got a short engagement of just a couple of hours, it is quite unlikely that you will get the person feeling comfortably enough with you to share acts of sexual violence. And I'll give you just a very simple example from my past experience. I've worked for a couple of years with the International Truth and Justice Project, which is an organization that documents torture and sexual violence committed by the Sri Lankan security forces. And I interviewed many victims in that context, and actually many male victims of detention and sexual violence. And very often, I was the first person they had told the details of the different forms of torture they had experienced and to whom they had disclosed that they had been the victim of sexual violence. And usually those interviews, they took place over, I would say 3 to 5 days. And I would say that on average, the worst forms of sexual violence came out on and the sexual violence and the worst form of torture, other forms of torture as well, on the third day. But before that, on the first day, I had taken lots of time to ask those witnesses to tell me about their whole life story, where they were born, where they went to school, tell me everything about their families, how they were captured, how they were, imprisoned, to describe the room in which they were kept, describe the type of interrogation, so going really slowly. And then it became very natural for them to have me asking very detailed questions about, their studies. So when we got to more difficult subjects, they were also used to that and felt comfortable to disclose more.
Danае, thank you so much for being so precise and so practical really in your response, because I think we should engage with the prejudices and fears that also the different stakeholders documenting CRSV have. And one of the recent arguments that I have heard actually from a Ukrainian prosecutor was that they said, well, how can we build the case just on the testimonial evidence? Look what the Russians are doing. They would just film a propaganda video where people would, say certain horrific things allegedly perpetrated by Ukrainians. Therefore, we need collaboration. Therefore, we need other types of evidence. But I think if they listened to the very detailed advice that you're given, so it's not just recording a testimonial story, it's how you build this testimonial evidence derived from a victim or a witness, that will definitely show that it's very valid and merits procedural, validity and attention. We already have a couple of questions to you, Danае, but I think we'll now turn to Amal, and then we will come back with the questions to both of you. Okay, thank you very much, Danае. And Amal, it's such a joy to have you here with us today. You who worked on Ukraine and for Ukraine and with Ukraine so much. And perhaps when you tell about your work on sexual violence in Ukraine, could you explain a little bit why the survivor-centric perspective is on the one hand so important, but on the other hand, unfortunately, still so rare, and why we need to change that? Thank you.
So much, Katerina, and I really want to also start by thanking the organizers, not only for organizing this session in general and inviting us to participate, but also for including aspect and attention to reparations, because this topic remains underexplored, and this right, so the right to reparation, remains largely unfulfilled around the world. That this opportunity to talk about it for Ukraine specifically is hugely important. And I would be extremely happy to share how we conducted this study on reparations for sexual violence survivors in Ukraine in a way that engaged survivors and placed their opinions and views at the center. But I want to really start by putting definition the term reparations, because perhaps we hear it often, but we might all define it in our own ways. But generally speaking, when we say reparations, we are referring to a set of measures that are taken normally by the state, acknowledge the occurrence of crimes the victims of those crimes and to deal with the consequences that these crimes has had on victims, but also on their families and society as a whole. An aspect of reparations as well is to prevent these crimes from happening again. So to take measures that address the root causes of these crimes with a view of ending them, with a view of preventing this cycle of violence that we really keep seeing in many conflicts around the world. And reparations are often adopted in countries experiencing conflicts, but they are also relevant to other situations, such as situations of dictatorship, political violence, oppression more broadly, and even racial injustice and legacies of colonization. So they are hugely essential, but importantly, also a legal right for survivors. But as Danае said in her introduction, despite it being a legal right, it is really largely unfulfilled for victims of all crimes, not only for sexual violence, but especially for victims of sexual violence around the world, who remain waiting for this right to be fulfilled, because it's really one of the responses to conflict victims demand the most, but unfortunately see the least. So it is against this backdrop that this study, the global study on reparations, was conducted, which Ukraine was part of along 25 or more than 25 other countries. And our goal was to understand what has been done, what can be done, and what should be done for victims of sexual violence to access reparations. And to do that, we really needed to understand first, what are the harms? What are we trying to address specifically? And without going to survivors and to victims directly and understanding from them the harms that they have experienced and what they need for these harms to be addressed and redressed, we really would not be able to adopt right responses. So this was really the methodology in practical terms for the study that we have conducted. So the methodology was context-driven, victim-centered. What does that mean? We started working on Ukraine for this study 2 years ago, but there have been already actors involved on the ground for over 8 years working with victims, perhaps not on reparations specifically, but really on documentation, on assistance, on provision of medical care, psychological assistance, and they have huge expertise. So we made sure that in our study, we tap into that expertise and we partner with these very important actors. So in our study, we partnered up with 3 very reputable civil society organizations, and they are Truth Hounds, Bluebird, and Eastern Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, who jointly with the Global Survivors Fund conducted this study over the past 2 years. And secondly, we have engaged survivors directly in the study. We had the participation of 27 survivors, women and men, in the study, who responded to a standardized questionnaire where we asked them about how sexual violence impacted them, how it has impacted their families, and how it impacted society more broadly in their views. And we really wanted to understand directly from them their needs and what they perceive as reparations. So we went to them and asked, what is reparation to you? What would respond to the harms that you are experiencing present, because they continue to experience it today, even if it was committed 8 years ago, or less, or even if it was committed more recently. And that is essential, because if we are really wanting to deal with the consequences of crimes, we have to engage those who experience those very same crimes. Other than that, we might put in place a response that really does not correspond to the problem and to the demands of these survivors. But also, we would deprive victims and survivors of the opportunity to act as rights holders. They want to actually be engaged. They want to articulate their needs themselves. And if we don't give them this opportunity, then we are depriving them of this chance that would really empower them and restore their agency as rights holders. I want to quickly say that the principles that Danае, some of them that she mentioned in her presentation, so confidentiality, do no harm, were extremely relevant also to our work. So we made sure that in our work, to be truly victim-centric, we're also adopting measures that we too are not in our research harming victims. So we have made sure that we are putting in place psychological care, and I see there's a question on that we'll engage with shortly. We made sure that victims had the option of having a psychologist present as part of the research, but also that there were other activities that are aimed at alleviating the trauma. Of course, we were not able to deal with the trauma completely, but we have taken steps to make sure that this is at least alleviated and that they are equipped with some skills that they can use also at the daily level, ensure that they can also cope with their own situations, and in some cases also referred them to other needed services. I want to say that this research has taken around 2 years to be completed because it has been conducted in a careful manner, and in an empowering manner, where we also made sure that we are raising awareness amongst survivors themselves of their rights, that these crimes that have taken place and that we have experienced are a violation of their rights, and that should be redressed, which is in fact a legal right. And the findings of our research have been published earlier this month. The report in English is on our website, and I will put a link now in the chat. And the report is now available in Ukrainian. We will upload it to our website very shortly, any day now, perhaps even on Monday. So we hope that the participants to this session will also consult this report, which really brings attention to the scope and scale of sexual violence in Ukraine since 2014. What are the experiences of survivors, and what needs to be done to respond to the harms that they have experienced?
Amal, thank you so much, and thank you for really underlying not just your hands-on experience, but for, I would say, the twofold experience, because on the one hand, it's learning from the survivors, but in a very sensitive manner. But on the other hand, it's also enlightening them and the Ukrainian society, for whom, as we figured out during the study, the word reparation is usually associated with something that a state pays to another state, or in the context after the World War II. And even now, the whole debate about reparation is more about the infrastructural recovery of Ukraine rather than the individual support to survivors. And it's great that the organization like yours and Ukraine's human rights group are actually asking the Ukrainian government and the partners, so which portion of those reparations will be directed at specific survivors. And this is my question. What are your key findings, Amal, regarding the preferences of Ukrainians who have been affected by different forms of conflict-related sexual violence with respect to reparations, and how different or not these preferences are to other contexts on which you worked on? Thank you.
Such an essential and important question, Katerina, because we always say that you cannot just copy and paste one experience to another. There might be similarities between situations of armed conflict and demands for reparations, but really each situation is unique and requires a dedicated attention and a contextualized attention that really deals with the specificities of this situation. So similar actually to other situations, what we saw in Ukraine is that undoubtedly sexual violence has had severely impacted victims, their families, and society more broadly. The survivors that participated in the research described severe psychological impacts such as anxiety, depression, feeling unsafe, and of great relevance, of course, is the constant fear of repetition of these crimes, a fear, unfortunately, that they now see materializing as the conflict unfolds and as reports of sexual violence continue to grow. They have also described how difficult it is for them to speak about their experiences with even the closest to them, so their families, their friends, and how that results in them feeling distant from their family members. And of course, they also detailed other impacts, including economic impacts, which relate to the losses that they experience, the losses of housing, the losses of jobs, and other livelihood that they relied on to really move in their lives. And when we asked them then what would repair these harms that they have experienced, they did not name just one thing, because as you see, they experienced different harms personally, but also at the family level. And all of these harms need to be addressed. So they really have, most survivors have underlined the importance of psychological care as part of reparation. And it was almost asked by all survivors, and that should be made available as soon as possible and in an adequate manner. So not just 1 or 2 sessions, but really on the long term. Medical care has also been extremely important to survivors. So medical care that is free, covers medicine and other needs in a way that is comprehensive, but also not complex. Survivors they actually described difficulties in accessing the services, the medical services that they need in a smooth manner, because sometimes they could not really navigate where to find these services and how to access them. But they also needed support in accessing, in having housing. Housing was a huge demand for survivors because many of them have also been displaced. So that compounds their experience and the harms that they are experiencing. So collectively, these are issues that they have identified as parts of reparations, but really essentially what survivors really wanted is to have acknowledgement. They wanted acknowledgement of sexual violence, that it has been part of the conflict, and of them as survivors. They did not want to be invisibilized. And they wanted to have a victim status, so that status gives recognition to these harms, but also ties to it the reparation that they could benefit from. So the things that I just mentioned. And finally, what I want to say, and this is something we also saw in other situations, survivors want to have a role. They want to be consulted, engaged actively, and to play a meaningful role where their rights are affected. And as one survivor said in our study, why for us, but without us? And that really relates to all discussions that are taking place without them, but in fact, dealing with their rights and their needs.
Thank you very much, Amal. And I think what was very striking to hear from me, from survivors, was that when they said that housing for them was the question of security, the physical security that you've got your own spot, your own castle, which will not be invaded. And then how with this the new full-scale invasion, how they commented that this has essentially penetrated their deepest fears, that essentially the violations might further and cripple. And these are the things that the most good-willing human rights lawyers, be they from the human rights community or from the government, are unable to come up with unless they have been through that experience. And that is why, as you're saying, the survivors should not be just the objects of receiving help, but the equal co-contributors to designing the policies, the reparations policies they are to benefit from. And probably the final question to you, Amal, from me, and then we will turn to Q&A. And as you said, it's amazing that we already have a couple of questions related to the psychological well-being, both of those working on these issues, but also concerning the survivors. But before that, could you perhaps outline the key steps which both the government of Ukraine, but also Ukraine's international partners should do in the nearest future, and then also long-term, to proactively and sustainably help the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence? Thank you.
Thanks, Katerina. This is really the heart of our study as well, because as I said, we wanted to identify what has been done and what should be done. And in our study, we show that to date, and because we have been following the situation before the breakout of the invasion this year, but what we found is that there is no comprehensive policy for remedy in Ukraine for all crimes, not only for conflict-related sexual violence. And this comprehensive policy is needed because it will deal in a comprehensive manner with the consequences of these crimes. We know that what we would like to see is a comprehensive reparations program for conflict-related sexual violence survivors. So as Danае mentioned in the beginning, because court processes and the courts awarding reparations are likely to be complex and lengthy processes, what we are recommending, and it's actually international good practice, is the creation and establishment of administrative reparation program. And what that means, so just to also explain what that means, it is a program that is established by law, either by law or by a decree, for example, that is not a courtroom process. It's a program that is not really tied to the establishment of guilt of a perpetrator and then from that victims having reparations. It's only a program that would actually be open and would determine who is a victim of conflict-related sexual violence based on a set of criteria that would be adopted, but is likely friendlier. The burden of proof is lighter. So that would be, as a result, more inclusive and more victim-friendly, actually, would just cover a large pool of victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And that is what we are trying to establish. The establishment of that, of course, would require some legislative work, and that is why in our study we recommend both the parliament to, well, firstly the parliament to pass a law that would establish that, which might need a bit of time. So for the urgency, make sure that victims' needs are not left unaddressed and the harms that they experience might become irreparable, we really call on the president of Ukraine to issue a presidential decree that would put in place this program, this reparation program, which still might need some time to develop. And for that, we also call on the president in this decree to establish an interim reparations program that could be put in place more urgently to deliver and respond to the most urgent needs of victims, and to make sure that those needs are not left unaddressed. So that is what is needed, of course, at the Ukrainian level. Of course, all of this needs funding. It also needs technical assistance. And this is where the international community comes at play, because the international community could help, firstly, by providing the lessons learned and technical experience tailored to the Ukrainian context. But importantly, they could also help in financing reparations. We all know that Russia is also responsible, or largely responsible, for these crimes, but they will unlikely voluntarily pay reparations for these very first crimes. But the international community can help with that, because as we explore in our report, the sanctions framework and that is imposed on Russian oligarchs, companies, and individuals can really be explored, find and used by repurposing these sanctioned assets to delivering reparations for survivors. So that is something that the international community can really look into. Not the only way, of course, that reparations should be financed more broadly by the international community, but the sanctions regime can really help in financing this urgent but also comprehensive reparation programs.
Thank you very much, Amal. And ladies, we're almost an hour in our discussion, so I suggest that we move to the Q&A session. And shall we start with a question that actually deals with coercive circumstances? And if I may, I would address it to you, Danае, and perhaps Amal, you'd want to add. So in the context of conflict-related sexual violence, would the mere establishment of an armed conflict be recognized as the coercive circumstances where consent was not possible, or perhaps the other circumstances are by default coercive? Danае, could you comment on that?
Thank you. So the may, of course, for as part of the evidence that you will need to gather, you will want to show that there is a context of armed conflict as part of the contextual elements that you need to prove. But the mere existence of an armed conflict in itself will not be sufficient. You will also need to gather additional information about, for instance, heavy military presence, or so there will be, you will need additional information to really show that, in the specific instance, in the part of, the region itself, you had a really coercive environment. I don't know, Amal, if you want to complement, maybe.
Perhaps just to add that, of course, we need to also demonstrate the nexus to the armed conflict, because sometimes crimes, including sexual violence, might take place in a situation of armed conflict, but it's not necessarily a war crime because it's not really linked to this armed conflict. So we really need to tie it. How is it related to the armed conflict? Is, for example, the person visibly wearing a uniform? Is it taking place in a station or like a base of a certain battalion, and so on? So this nexus we also need to demonstrate it to prove that this can be a war crime. And then, of course, Danае covered the other aspect of the question.
Thank you, ladies. And I think what's also relevant for the context of Ukraine, both pre-February and post-February this year, is how the coercive environment was or could be potentially pretty much established in cases of unlawful detention centers. And this is where the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia would be so guiding for us. And the final two questions we have so far, I think, are crucially important because they concern the psychological well-being. And if I may, I would address the first question as to whether it is advisable to engage a psychologist to the victim for the victim during the interview, or in particular, would you recommend that for a juvenile victim? And then, ladies, if you could comment on the good practices or something that practically has worked for you because you work so much on very complicated and emotionally demanding issues. What are the approaches to self-care and support of yourself which you would recommend? Because I think even if this debate about self-help is emerging among the human rights community, the criminal justice sector, investigators and prosecutors just don't speak about it. But obviously they're so affected by the amount of heavy workload related to war crimes which they have. So any recommendations about maintaining one's emotional well-being would be very appreciated. Who would want to start about the psychologist during the interview recommendation?
Go ahead.
I just want to say we are seeing now some efforts to bring in psychologists to an interview, and those of course are driven by the best intentions to conduct an interview with care. That is not sufficient, of course, and actually sometimes it's really too late, because the best practice is to do an assessment prior to even deciding conduct an interview on whether this interview should take place. Because if we do this assessment and we think that the victim, for psychological reasons, but also for other reasons, should not undergo this interview, then us bringing in a psychologist to the interview is really not going to help. Because if the level of trauma is severe, if the victim is completely destabilized, then the psychologist is not going to do much, or even if she's the best at her job, or his job, that's not going to be sufficient. So we really need an in-advance assessment, a really sober call whether this interview should take place. And if the answer is no, then it should really be no, and the interview should not take place. And I'm sure Danае will comment on this, and then we can return to the juvenile part as well.
Yeah, no, but absolutely. So I think you highlight, that's all part of, as you say, you mentioned that assessment. That's part of the planning phase, and it's really if the person is not emotionally stable, but also sometimes all the important needs of the victims needs to be addressed first. So interviewing, accessing justice very often comes way later. You cannot interview a victim or a witness if they're still bleeding, or if they're starving, or if they've got like their priorities are more survival. I think it would be highly inappropriate. So there's a time for everything. So that's why also some form of reparation actually should not come as an afterthought. They should come first. The medical, psychological support should come in first, and then if the witness feels comfortable enough and is willing and keen, and if it makes sense, and if you've done all your assessments, then you can conduct an interview. And then, indeed, best practice is to have a psychologist, before, during, after, but to have some proper support in place. And actually, if you can't provide that kind of support, you will create more harm, and it's really dangerous. So you should not conduct the interview. So that's actually, if you think about, there's many situations where it's better to refrain, because you will, even if the person is willing to speak, because sometimes also some witness, they're quite keen to speak because they want to unload, but they should probably not unload with a documenter. They should speak to a psychologist first, who can really, has no, there's no agenda in receiving that story. It's really about, listening to the person and making them feel comfortable, and try to help them to overcome the trauma.
Thank you very much, Danае. And ladies, perhaps you could comment with some practical examples of how to maintain one's self-help and well-being. And I can say that the way Amal organized that for me and my colleague Alexa during our work was really exceptional. Very simple advice, like don't work from bed, for instance, or delineate your office and home space, or don't work like 3 hours before you go to sleep. And that was so simple, but so helpful. So what other pieces of advice could you give, Amal and then Danае, please?
I mean, there are a lot of things that we can do at the personal level. Of course, this is very difficult work. And even sometimes if we take all of those steps, it will be difficult work. We cannot really remove that difficulty, because we are dealing with very, very sad stories and heartbreaking stories. I want to really highlight the responsibility of organizations as well, and how the work is organized. We should really not put like targets on our documenters and send them to the field and say, by end of the day, come back with 10 stories or 10 testimonies. Practices like that, to be honest, we've heard that, so it's not unheard of, or it's not like it doesn't happen. So at the organizational level, there needs to be good practice, that persons are not pressured into conducting work in a way that harms the documenter, but also by extension the victim. So that would be kind of a first step, and then to also make sure that when you are working on a charged environment, so also beyond the fact that the stories are difficult. I mean, Katerina, you were also explaining to us the sirens going on, or different times of the day, and that is highly stressful. The environment itself is highly stressful. So we really need to make sure that, because we are in this environment and we are doing difficult work, that all staffers engaged need to have the opportunity to rest, to take breaks. And that doesn't need to necessarily be only in the weekend. If they feel that they are overloaded and cannot take it, they should be allowed to take a pause and recompose themselves and feel better, and then return to work. Otherwise, we are risking burnout and also long-term consequences. And then there are, of course, steps at the individual levels, which you've highlighted, Katerina, very well, and perhaps Danае can also explore further.
Thank you, Amal. Yeah, so totally agree with everything that you said, and the responsibility of the organization in terms of practical steps. It's important also, for instance, to have regular debriefing. I think just to first also acknowledge that this, you can suffer from vicarious trauma, and that it's absolutely normal. That's already is a big thing. Then, in terms of, tips, you can think about, combining exposure to very difficult material about sexual violence and other violent crime with, other, legal work, more administrative work, either, as you structure your day, or you've got, a period of a couple of days where you conduct interviews. It's very heavy, but then you need to remove yourself, because otherwise it's going to be too much. I think, you mentioned some of the, the tips that, work, in terms of compartmentalizing compartmentalizing the space, but also, you know, sometimes it's about, you know, each person is different, but exercising, meditating, or, you know, once you finish, you know, your really heavy work, you know, having a shower to cleanse or go for a walk. And you know, generally speaking, as Amel mentioned, try to have, you know, and I know it's very difficult to say when you know, it's challenging, you know, when you're in actually the midst of conflict, but try to, you know, have kind of good work-life balance. Try to, you know, stop, accept that you may, you know, not be able to conduct that time for extended periods of time, or maybe that it's just too much. And of course, you know, not only the environment in which you are, but also your personal circumstances will have an impact. If, you know, you are yourself a survivor of sexual violence or other violent crime, or you are in a context of conflict, actually you will necessarily be triggered more easily than someone who can easily return to a safe place. But I would say that just like being conscious, taking those few steps, and of course, if you need to, you know, ensure that you've got psychological support either on an ad hoc basis or on an ongoing basis.
Thank you very much, ladies. And I'll just admit, because for me, it was a very important aspect. And as you're saying, the institutional, the organizational culture, when I first heard that from actually my employer, that Katerina, you shouldn't work on this particular analysis of the interviews for more than 4 hours per day, that was very inspiring. And that actually inspired me afterwards to say, like, Amal, I need 2 more days or 5 more days to complete this work. So it's a very kind of simple human dynamics, but I think without this initial institutional outreach, I wouldn't even think to ask for the extension of deadline. And that really made a lot of difference. And as you're saying, also because this is such a, well, heavy and dark material to work with, not to take it everywhere with you, especially if you work from home, but to have a designated place, something very organized and strict, your table, and this is it, not from your bed. There was also the great advice. And I think it's also important that by, you know, staying aware and conscious and sound, we don't, as Danае and Amal have mentioned, we don't re-traumatize the survivors, but more importantly, we maintain also good family and friends relationships. We don't re-traumatize or traumatize our family members in an ununderstandable way. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so grateful to you for this, and I'm sorry that we probably took a little bit more time as always, but Victoria, if you have any further questions, recommendations to us, we are happy to have them.
Дякую за чудову, неймовірно цікаву лекцію, і що поділилися своїм досвідом, в тому числі те, як мати сили робити таку непросту роботу, як мати сили, аби допомагати іншим. У нас вже ще на самому початку лекції вже були коментарі про те, що інформація справді безцінна, і вони тільки їх ставало все більше і більше під кінець нашої сьогоднішньої сесії. Також я впевнена, що багато хто з присутніх сьогодні були на конференції, присвяченій дослідженню можливостей для надання репарацій потерпілим. І велике дякую за це унікальне дослідження, направду, для нас усіх, для правничої спільноти і для України. Ми всі чекаємо офіційного перекладу з нетерпінням і обов'язково поділимося, як тільки він буде. У мене насправді самої є ще декілька запитань. Якщо дозволите, я скористаюся нагодою. Це питання буде стосуватися самого інтерв'ю. У нас дуже часто просто на різних подіях вони виникають від юристок. Перше, як краще опитувати потерпілу? За один раз опитати повністю, так? Чи, можливо, краще розбити інтерв'ю на декілька там днів, так? Чи, можливо, навіть там на тижнів? Чи це залежить від конкретної ситуації? І одразу друге питання, воно з'явилося абсолютно недавно, від однієї теж з юристок, про те, якщо, наприклад, ти юристка, яка має клієнтку, яка потерпіла від СНПК, і чи можеш ти вказувати, чи тактовно вказувати таймінг інтерв'ю, наприклад, що у мене є час там до 16:00, бо потім у мене інша клієнтка, але ми розуміємо, що потерпіла може почати розповідати історію, і оцей таймінг може направду все зіпсувати. Як в такому випадку бути, і взагалі, чи тоді, можливо, варто залишити весь день, наприклад, так, виділити для цієї клієнтки? Дякую дуже.
happy to come in first, and then you can complement Amal. So for in terms of, the time, I would say that each time I've had to conduct such kinds of interviews, I always had the full day. And as I said, most of the time, I blocked, 3 days, and sometimes I even had to extend. So I think, it's really to, I've seen that in Bangladesh, so some people, especially human rights documenters documenting for advocacy, having lined up like 5 witnesses back to back, not only it raised huge issues of confidentiality, people seeing each other, but also, the pressure, and then, then you ask, because you've got a time limit, you ask question in an aggressive manner, and it's really, that's that's, for me, it's the really typical worst practice. So I think actually securing that's a very simple thing that you can do, but it will really go a long way. And then about your other question about seeing person once or several times, usually just the process of getting informed consent, of explaining, what the risks are, how you would protect the information, that can take hours. And then, at the end of this, maybe you need to, let the person, think about it for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then get back to you. So it's all part of building that rapport. But, it is impossible to say, okay, I've got 2 hours, we will do the informed consent, the interview, the full interview, the closure. It's really bad practice, and you won't get the information, and you will re-traumatize the person. So so I'll leave it there. Yeah, Amal, maybe you can add.
I really think you covered it comprehensively, Danае, but I just want to, of course, acknowledge that not all victims and that we will engage with are the same. Some will really require a lot of time and speak at length. So we should always plan for that. And then on the other hand, we will have those who will really give only short answers. And we, as best practice, of course, Danае presented that earlier, we are trying to give them the opportunity to have a free recall. So we're not going to be telling them, please wrap it up because I have something else to do. That's not going to work. Then that's not really a free recall. We're already structuring and putting a time limit on them. So we really should always plan that it might take time, days even. If that time does not end up being used, you've still done the best practice by scheduling it and allowing it to take place. So always plan for that, even if you don't end up using it.
And I would want to, if possible, to briefly touch upon the situation when actually a survivor gives you more information than you expected, and in the circumstances where you didn't expect that to happen. I had a couple of situations when after more of the formal interviewing, we were commuting back together, and we took the train, and I saw that after 2 or 3 days of communication, it was when the person really wanted to speak and tell the story. And it was psychologically hard for me because that was not the context where I was ready to listen to be honest, especially after already 2 or 3 days of interviewing. And more importantly, there were other people on a train in our compartment. So that was a tricky situation when, in a way, I also as a lawyer had to protect the survivor and try to limit a little bit the things or the story about which they spoke, but also to let that story flow. So I would also say that in any context, when you meet the survivors, even if it's not for the official interview, try to make sure that this is the comfortable other place where just the 2 of you, or whether you will not be invaded also by other people, because you'd really also want to protect the survivor and the other people who might be nearby, not to listen to the conversations you're having.
Yeah, I think you want to say something?
No, but so the location, I think, about the choice of the location, you need to make sure that, it's, bad practice to meet in a public space, because of course people can overhear the conversation. So you should always look for a private space. usually, very often, survivors also, in their own home, it's not going to be private because they can have family members who can overhear them. So like the whole logistic about choosing a safe, secure location is very important also for survivors. If they don't want to disclose, very often they will have their relatives or people close to them who don't know what happened to them. So where do you meet? How do you explain that you've left for a whole day? So there's those considerations are really, really critical. So I think it's our responsibility as practitioners to make sure that we choose a location that are safe, that will not expose the people we're meeting, that and you can have like a cover story. You can you need to be able to explain to the people close to the witness why they were meeting with you. So it could be like as part of a in a meeting in a, I don't know, medical practice. There can be like a back room. So there's all sorts you need to see in the environment where you are and look for the best options not to expose the witness.
If I just come in quickly, I mean, this needs to also be reiterated to the interviewee in stating that this is also done as best practice and as part of the methodology used by the organization, because we will also observe that different victims might have, different levels of, reception to safety and privacy and so on. And some will actually want to speak publicly because they feel like that is something they would like to do, and they don't feel it's dangerous and so on. But you really need to explain your decisions as well, and make sure that the victim understands just because they find it okay and safe to speak publicly, that you also have a duty of care. And that is also why the interview cannot take place in this in this kind of circumstance.
Дякую велике. Насправді мені дуже відгукується те, що це наша відповідальність у першу чергу, і те, що справді потерпілі можуть про це не думати або не розуміти обсяг того, так що є, наприклад, тими самими персональними даними, і в тому числі коли доречно і недоречно про те чи інше говорити. Взагалі, сьогодні було насправді почуто стільки корисних і важливих практичних порад, починаючи так від того першого питання, яке ми сьогодні чули про наявність обставин примусу, так і зміщення факту в контексті доведення відсутності добровільної згоди. І коли Катерина, якщо не помиляюсь, сказала, чи хтось питатиме чоловіків, чи вони давали згоду і цього хотіли, так я про це, наприклад, навіть не думала, але це абсолютно логічно і, звичайно, виходить із стереотипів, так і від того суспільства, в якому, на жаль, живемо і де вони знаходять себе. Я насправді маю ще одне питання. Я знаю, що в нас вже підбігає наш час до кінця, але скористаюся нагодою. Чи будуть доказом, наприклад, ті свідчення, які зафіксували громадські організації, так, НГО в контексті міжнародної практики? Бо сьогодні часто медіа особливо так говорять українські про те, що громадські організації повинні працювати із тим і вчитися, так, аби фіксувати, документувати ті чи інші злочини, а в тому числі СНПК.
I'll go first then. Yeah, so of course there's many documenters. I think, you need to see, the first question is whether the documenter is mandated or not. And I think it will depend in, any context. I don't know sufficiently what would be the requirement on the Ukrainian law. But very often, documentation that has been conducted by NGO can, provide like a useful base of information. But very often when you have UN mechanism or courts, they will want to conduct their own interviews and own documentation. So a way not to, contaminate in a way the evidence field with all that over documentation by NGOs can be also to more like signposts. So you can, take, basic information, but not get into the details of exactly what happened, because of course, a survivor or victim who is being interviewed multiple times, the account will be different with slight difference each time. But then, of course, you know, if you go to court, then those differences can be used by the defense team and be, you know, shown as like inconsistencies and being used to challenge the account of the survivors, which is actually, in practice, you know, you will never tell twice the story in the same way. So I would say that, you know, of course, it's very important, the work that NGOs are doing, you know, it's hugely important. But then I think it's very important to think about collaboration platforms so that there's no duplication of work. Of course, that raises all sorts of questions around informed consent, the sharing of information. You know, you need to have protocols in that respect. So that creates some, you know, very tricky consideration. But it's it's important to ensure that there's no contamination of the evidence field and by over documenting, and that's something that we've seen in other contexts, and that's a fear from many practitioners about Ukraine.
And I will just add very briefly that from the perspective of the victims, this is really damaging and traumatizing, because we've heard in some situations of victims being interviewed more than 15 times, and importantly, as Danае said, sometimes by unmandated, not even entities, but even individuals, so also including journalists. And this is really ethical practice, and we really need to kind of share this knowledge and best practices, not just for civil society, but also with media, that you don't need to interview victims to tell a story. Actually, it's not necessary, and you're potentially harming these victims. So not only just harming them psychologically, often the victims will not be able to tell the differences between these different parties that interviewed them. They would not necessarily know the difference between the UN and the ICC and so on. So sometimes if we don't really sufficiently explain what is what and give victims a choice of when they can participate and when they cannot, we're also harming them, but also we're not helping them understand in these different processes, and for them to make a choice where to participate and where not.
Just a brief comment, if I may. Wayne George, who, as you know, at his Global Rights Compliance, have worked in and on Ukraine since 2015. So I think he's been, the international barrister most present in the country. He has recently spoken to one of the leading Ukrainian media about the problem and the fear that he has, that Ukrainian NGOs have a lot of good willingness, but they might benefit from the closer cooperation with investigation and prosecution. And I think this streamlining of the effort is something which is crucially needed, because we compete for receiving or helping receive justice for survivors, and not just seeing who will submit the best communication to the ICC. And I think this end aim should be what guides both state and non-state actors in their documentation efforts. And same with, for instance, the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council for Ukraine. They have said so expressly many times that they are open to engaging with the civil society. And I think this is another mode of translating the civil society effort into something more practicable. So it shouldn't be just, one communication from a human rights NGO to the ICC. It can be through cooperation with other state or state-related actors. Thank you.
Дякую велике. Безмежно, насправді, дякую, Амаль, Катерина, Данае. І не тільки за сьогодні, а за всю роботу, яку ви робите для правничої спільноти, для потерпілих і, звичайно, для України. Дуже дякую усім, хто сьогодні були присутні, за ваші питання, за інтерес і за те, що намагаєтеся так само робити усе, аби правосуддя і справедливість були відновлені. У нас в чаті зараз є безліч корисних посилань, якими поділилися наші чудові спікерки. Ми обов'язково їх продублюємо так само в нашому телеграм-чаті, і в тому числі обов'язково це зробимо у мейл-розсилці. Наприкінець, перед тим, як будемо прощатися, я тільки нагадаю тому числі про наших партнерів. Наш курс проводиться за підтримки проекту ООН «Жінки. Трансформаційні підходи для досягнення гендерної рівності в Україні», що фінансується урядом Швеції та співпраці з Офісом віце-прем'єр-міністерки з питань європейської та євроатлантичної інтеграції та урядовою уповноваженою з питань гендерної політики. І також, звичайно, дякую нашим перекладачкам. Всього найкращого, мирного завершення дня і вихідних. І дякую ще раз Данае, Амаль і Катерині.
Дуже дякую, колежанки. Бережіть себе.